everybody, this is Words of Sorrow, and I decided that I needed to refresh the tier list. It seems like every year I have to do this because despite there being no updates to the game, people just figure out how to play leaders in different ways, discover more about the game, so even without updates, there's innovation. But on top of that, I wanted to also do a unit tier list. This is something people had been asking for, but I had made one of these, but I had forgotten to include a few units, and I didn't want to make another one, but it seems someone else made one, so finally I've gotten around to doing it. I think I'm going to start with the leaders first, though, because I'm a bit more confident in my decisions here. And it's definitely changed quite a bit since the last tier list video I put up, which was more high effort than this one's gonna be, but I mean, if I'm gonna make a tier list like every year, this is definitely the easier way of doing things. I think we ought to start from the bottom, and in the bottom tier is Jerome, the worst leader in the game. He's just kind of super bare bones. His hero, super slow. Sure, you can still kite with the Mantis, but any banished can deal with that quite easily with scout units. Other UNSC typically have a way to handle it as long as they have a stun. They just stun you and then kill you. For some reason, it's really tough to get out of the Mantis sometimes. He just stays in it, and when he goes down, with the ship, he loses a little bit of his shield, and then he's just a super easy pick because he can't run away. Some people like to go Mastodons with him, but the issue with Mastodons is really their mobility, and the fact that you're paying for a unit that doesn't really do much on its own. There's a lot of management involved with building units and putting them in and making sure that those units have proper upgrades. If you want to go like Dispersion or CT, those are expensive, especially CT, having to go Grenade Throw, which is really a horrible upgrade, just to get CT in your Mastodons. Sometimes you'll see people throw a bunch of snipers. I call them sniper cars when you put a bunch of snipers into the Mastodons. But generally that just loses to air, because really anything other than infantry. I'll see people playing against the sniper cars, and they just spam infantry and wonder why they're losing, when you can build literally anything else and beat it. Omega Team is also very underwhelming. The Spartans miss their hijacks like half the time for some reason, and they're kind of the equivalent to Tech 2 heroes, but also kind of not. Leon in particular is pretty weak, and other than that, he really doesn't have all that much going for him. Sure, Inspire is nice, but compared to the buffs other leaders have, it doesn't really stack up, and add that on top of his kind of not so great hero unit, definitely fell from grace. The fact that his turret drop, it's nice that you get 2, and they're great, but you can't target them. If you could target them, it would be fantastic, because it can help you main down a base very quickly, but it doesn't really matter when you can't tell him what to shoot. So, he's also just very power hungry. That upgrade for the Jerome hero is 400 power. And being a UNSC, you just get bullied off of power by any banished. So it's a struggle playing Jerome, and that is why he is all the way down, the worst leader in the game. And who I would say the second worst leader in the game is Kinsano. I've been a Kinsano hater for a long time now. You have no usable Tech 1 hero. That hurts a lot. Basically forces you into playing Jackrabbit a lot of the time. Sure, you can kind of go for an infantry ball, but that doesn't really work against a lot of banished who can just go like Chopper Sui or Ghost Sui, and then you can't do anything. And even when you do play Rabbit, it's often just fighting a losing battle, and a lot of maps don't cater to that kind of style, so she's only viable on a few maps. And while she can be good on like a map like Mirage or Vault, she's just so overshadowed by Cutter and of course by Forge. She gets super hard countered by Forge. It is known for being one of the worst matchups in the game, mostly because, on top of having no usable Tech 1 hero, she has Flame Hogs instead of regular Hogs. And while they're great versus infantry, if you're a good player, you're not really going to be building infantry against Kinsano, especially if they're building Flame Hogs. Of course, they can also drop them, so generally the rule of thumb is to just spam vehicles against her, and it typically works out pretty well. Hit and run is the name of the game when you're playing Kinsano, but it just feels so bad to never be able to take an engagement. Even when you think you can, it seems like you can't. And on paper, her leader powers look good, and they are. You got a great passive in both Heat of Battle and Redline. Turret drop, it's a nice stun. You get a good 4th point drop with those Flame Hogs, and a great 5th point drop, and Inferno is great for stripping bases. She also has a good late game, like Napalm Missiles 3 is even better than Inferno, but that's all on paper. In practice, it just doesn't ever seem to work out that way. I know Rock has been going for like some Kodiak plays on Tech 2 with her, but I still do think she's very exploitable in Tech 1 in a lot of scenarios, and that's really what this tier list is based around. How many scenarios are you viable in? And Kinsano is just not too high up on that list. So it hurts to see that on paper it seems good, but in practice it's just not. And in that same tier, I would put Serena, who is, I'd say on some maps worse than Kinsano, but on other maps a whole lot better, because she has a super strong cheese play. Basically, if it's a small map, like Frontier, Fissures, Mirage can work too, kind of. Basically, your hero Rax play is very strong. If you get a Bison on top of someone's base, it's already looking very good for you. On top of that, you should be hold positioning your Cryo Troopers on mini bases, and just being able to slow down their economy, it's really good for you, especially because on 3rd point you get a heal, and the Bison's heal rate is super good. It's just a pain in the ass to kill, and it doesn't even really matter once you lose it, as long as you've done enough damage to the economy. Another plus side is the watchtowers. Often what makes Banished so oppressive is the fact they have these really strong Tech 1 building killer units, but that just doesn't really apply to Serena because you can't attack her base. As long as she builds the $400 defense, you just can't touch the pads without freezing, because the freeze rate on those watchtowers are insane. Actually quite a bit faster than the freeze rate for the turrets, which is an interesting decision by the devs, but you know, it's not like it's ever changing. The issue comes with basically everything else. Those are the positives, and that's where it ends. On big maps, just forget it. Oftentimes your biggest strength is being able to hold the nodes, and the Frost Aura making a big problem for your opponent. But imagine Ashes. If you hold the nodes on Ashes, it doesn't really matter, because what are they doing for you? No army is ever going to be forced to walk through one of those. So compare that to Frontier or Bedrock, where the army of your opponent is going to be having to go through there whenever they want to go across the map, and that sucks for them. But on other maps, it's a complete fail, and it does absolutely nothing for you. The Kodiaks are pretty good, but I do think they're not quite as good as like Anders Kodiaks. They're not as oppressive. The Tech 3 Bison is great and all, but it's just getting there often is a struggle. The Tech 2 is pretty weak. Like I said, the 3rd point heal is nice for the Bison, but all in all, getting heal on 3rd point, that's kind of a weak option. You could also go for Cryoseismic, but then you don't actually have leader power for 3rd point, because you have to wait for 4th point in order to use it, and that just sucks, because 3rd point is such a pivotal part in the game. Cutter gets ODST, and what does Serena get? Literally nothing. Other leaders get stuff like Beam, Colony Drop, Turret Drop even is better, I'd say. But her drop is okay. It's just that I think the Cryo Troopers are a bit of a kind of weak. You get, I believe it's 2 tanks, Frost Raven, and then 2 Cryo Troopers. The tanks are nice, especially if you're playing against a Banished who's trying to go like quick Wraith on you. But the Cryo Troopers, sure, it's nice to have them just to hold position on minis, but later on in the game, little stuff like that, it's way easier for your opponent to deal with. Whereas early on in the game, where they're struggling to come up with a solution to this Bison that's threatening their base, and you've got these Cryo Troopers locked down on their minis at the same time, and population in the early game is way lower, so of course the Frost mechanic is going to be stronger. But as the game goes on, she just loses her potency. But I don't want to spend too much time on her. Let's see, who do we think the next should be? I would say Anders. I think Anders is the 4th worst leader, unfortunately. I love playing Anders, and I think, don't get me wrong, I think that she can win against anyone, but it's just tougher than if you were almost anyone else. The Sentinel, of course, is an amazing unit. Once again, the issue is getting there. It's expensive. It's a lot of pop. A lot of leaders have good solutions for it as well. Like Johnson, I don't even like going for it against Johnson, because they EMP Mac you and you're stunned for like half an hour. So they should just be able to get an insta-kill on it. Yap can stun it with units that cost 120 blue, which is pretty insane. Decimus can do the same thing with Vortex, which costs so little, and I just think when a unit costs that much, it really shouldn't be getting stunned by these paltry little things, but unfortunately it's not immune, and often you can lose it, and if you lose the Retriever like that, it's just insta GG. That said, a well-preserved Retriever can be an absolute asset. Oftentimes, you'll see a Retriever come in, and if the player is good, they don't poke around with it too much. They wait for their opponent to make a move, and then they go counter push. It makes it super difficult for the enemy to do any kind of offense, because they have this thing just constantly threatening to kill their base in like 2 seconds. And of course that allows Anders to buy up all of the other bases on the map, affording her a pretty good economy to go into Kodiaks, which I think is a stronger option than with Serena. The Kodiaks are just insane. Even after all the changes throughout the years that they received, they're still a very good option. You can still just go hog, and that's fine, but I do like the Kodiaks very much. The problem is the Tech 1 is also kind of weak. It's kind of the inverse of Serena, where you don't really want to have to play long Tech 1. But the way the meta is developed, I'd say it's a very offensive meta, where playing Tech 1 is rewarded, and you don't want to have a weak Tech 1. Unfortunately, Anders does. And while you have a pretty strong mid game if you can play it well, she also doesn't have an amazing late game. The Protector Sentinels, as much as I like to do gimmicks with them, they do have some niche scenarios, but generally they're not really much better than Hornets, and Hornets are not good units either, so there's not too much going for the late game Anders. So moving on, I would say, who's next? Probably Isabel. Probably here. I think Isabel is better than Anders by a little bit. Having access to Assembly 2 by 3rd point is pretty nice. Those hogs are super cheap. And Holo Decoy is great as well, forcing Detect. And really on Tech 1, oftentimes you're not going to have any Detect, and Holo Decoy becomes a pretty big issue. Alice is the best Tech 2 Spartan. Douglas is pretty good, but he doesn't quite compare. Obviously your late game is one of the best, I'd say second best in the game next to Arbiter. The tanks, super good, and all your late game powers, you have combat salvage, you have heal heavy metal. That's another thing that Anders lacks, heavy metal. That would be nice to have. Best offense, not just the shielded canny buffed tanks, but you get them on the Gales as well. Just a pretty solid, you were getting kind of up there on the list. I think Isabel may have some room to go up, but maybe not, we'll see. Let's see, who do we think is next? This is where it starts to get a little more difficult. See, I think Johnson, you might notice that Johnson used to be super low, and that is no longer the case. I don't want to say Decimus. It's probably Pavium. Pavium is just kind of there, very bare bones banished. Sure, Burnout level 3 on 3 generators is really insane, and the research time is also quite nice. You can get super fast wraiths, a super fast vehicle level 3, and that's nice. I think the issue is your Tech 1 oftentimes is a little lackluster. Your late game also is super defensive. You're great on defense. Mega turrets are great. You have healing bases, you can make your bases invulnerable, all that, but those are all leader powers that apply to your bases and defense. You can't win with just defense. You have to be able to win with offensive leader powers, which he really lacks. Lich, I'd say, after the second Lich, it's like a little bit inconsequential, because that's when you're getting into the late game and people are going to have Fortify. They're going to have enough power to have a bunch of anti-air turrets, or just a big enough army to shoot it out of the sky and not care about it. He has his strengths. A very quick tech up with Burnout. You can spam more than any other leader, pretty much. He can almost keep up with Forge's eco, but I wouldn't quite say he can, because Forge just trades very cost efficiently. His hero is decent. You can do some leader power combos with it, but I'd say he's kind of a mediocre hero in the grand scheme of things, but not bad. So that's kind of what puts him more in the middle of the pack. But next, I would say, is Johnson. And I don't know, maybe people think he should be even higher, but I think this is as high as I can put him. The bunker play is quite strong. You have to be pretty forward thinking with your placement. Just as long as it's covering a node or something, generally that's a good idea. Against Brute Banished, it makes it super annoying to take the nodes back, because your grunts are never going to take the node until they've killed the bunker. And obviously that's a pretty big issue. Bunker level 2 is also a strong play. And once again, often what was considered a big weakness for Johnson were his Mantis, simply because they're not as fast as Warthogs, they're more expensive. Sure, they're better in a head-on fight, but oftentimes when you're playing UNSC, that's not what you want to do. You just want to be over the map and harassing with hogs, and Johnson doesn't so much have that available to him, but he can kind of do that with bunkers. And like I said with Kinsano, you can kind of cancel out that weakness by just building Kodiaks instead. The hero was kind of slept on in the past, like with Forge and a heavy metal Forge Hog. It makes it a lot harder to kill. Shipmaster, you have Extract and all that, and a Cloak as well. Johnson has the bunker and a heal, and that's nice. I wouldn't say it's quite on the same level as Ship, but it's pretty good. Just being able to save him, get out of jail free card is quite nice. And of course his late game, absolutely insane. Free pads, you get Colossus, which are pretty good units, but you also have combat salvage, which means your vulture play is very strong. Not only is it strong because of that, but your free pads make it pretty easy to get into them quicker than most other leaders would be able to. And that alone is a pretty big upside. Next, probably would have to be Decimus. I think Decimus, I love Decimus, he's one of my favorite leaders, but I can't put him any higher than this. His Tech 1 is lacking. All he's really got is Vortex. Siphon is okay, but I find Siphon more useful later on when I actually have like a big mass of units, or rather I have pockets of like Dark Skies everywhere and I just want a little bit more Siphon. But that's where he really shines. Once you hit that 4th point, that 5th point, you have Dark Skies all over the map. He has the strongest Dark Sky play, I'd say. Pavium has a good Dark Skies play, so does like Voridus and Atriox, but Decimus just head over shoulders as the strongest because of that Boundless Siphon just being so incredibly strong on them. Like I said, with Anders and Serena, it's the issue of getting there. You have much better tools of getting there than these two leaders, though, and that's the difference. Oftentimes you can just kind of play defensively, maybe tech up depending on the map, or play Chopper Sui, or just kind of try and be everywhere from the start of the game, because a lot of players struggle with that. All units players just will instantly fold to double racks plays, but that can only carry you so far. A lot of leaders are able to exploit his early game weakness, like Cutter. For instance, the Cutter versus Decimus matchup, I'd say I kind of slightly favor Decimus, but it is actually very tough before you get that 4th point. And even once you have 4th point, it doesn't matter if you get it if you have no units. That's the thing. You have to play pretty carefully until you hit that point. And after that, it does flip. The matchup just completely flips. And that applies to a lot of Decimus's matchups. Just being able to be all over the map with Dark Skies. I know the noobs think that Banshees are incredible, but that's not what makes them good. It's the Dark Skies. If you don't use Dark Skies, then play Decimus and build them, and you'll see why it's strong. And of course, the Korisasu drop, obviously strong. I'd say actually one of Decimus's weaknesses, though, is his hero unit. And I know people like the Warlord and all that, I just think it doesn't really synergize with his strongest play, which is Dark Skies. You're not going to be pushing just one place with them, so it doesn't make sense to build a hero unit when you're going to be building these a bunch of cheap units to fight everywhere at once. Although he is good at canceling out other heroes, I'll give it that. I just think that it doesn't exactly synergize with his style. That said, you can play Decimus in more of an all units way. I just don't find that to be the optimal way to play it. Next, I'll be honest, around this area is where I'm kind of least confident. I don't really know where to put Vortis. I've been playing him a little more now, but I think he's just kind of hard to tell where to place. His matchups are all over the place. He generally does better against other Banished than against UNSC. Of course, that doesn't apply to Trox. Trox is a horrible matchup for him. But against Decimus, for example, Decimus just can't do anything. But playing against UNSC is tough because they can get a pretty strong Tech 1 infantry ball going and brute force you. I feel he kind of takes a little bit of time to get going. He wants to get that third point Invigorating Frenzy, which is super strong, and it's nice when you're pushing a base with it. And Grenadier Drop is nice. Your first 3 points are all amazing leader powers. Combat Spoils, Grenadier Drop, Invig. But the issue is your units. Grenadiers are nice. I kind of still prefer Suicide Grunts though. I'm just a big Suicide Grunt fan. I think a lot of people would disagree with that, but I just love Suicide Grunts. So I miss them when I'm playing Vortis. His hero unit is a Warlord without a pull, which I didn't like the Warlord. I actually kind of like the Vortis hero a little more, even though he is a bit weaker in the grand scheme of things. But that's because you just need a way to spread a bunch of goo. And that does synergize with Vortis' playstyle, whereas I don't think the Warlord does so much, even though it's a stronger unit in the grand scheme of things. I think grunt spam is strong with this leader. Being able to grunt mine a generator is always great. If you can get into that position, chances are you're going to win the game. You're not always going to be able to get into that kind of position though, and that's the issue. And later on, Vortis really does taper off. He has to make a Scarab play and win with it. If you lose the Scarab, you're probably going to lose the game. And that's been my take ever since like 2018. And it continues to be the truth, just because his late game is non-existent. Compare him to any other Banished, and he just pales in comparison. Maybe not Pavium, but Pavium at least has strong defense. Not so much offense, but defense. So you won't lose with Pavium, you just won't win. With Vortis, you still very much will lose in the late game. But like I said, this area of the tier list is where I'm the least confident, because he's been kind of gentleman's agreemented out of existence for years now, and only now are some people starting to pick him up again. I think without combat spoils, he's almost unplayable. It's pretty bad. But, like I said, not super confident in the placement, but I think somewhere around here, or, I don't know, higher or lower, just because I said his matchups are super volatile. Next, I'm going to say Yap Yap, which once again, that's a big change. I would have probably had him in God not too long ago. But once again, Rock, the player I keep bringing up, kind of highlighted a few weaknesses, and maybe I agree with this just because I don't have a strong Yap, and Rock also I don't think has a super strong Yap compared to some people. We share that in common. But the points he raises are valid anyway. The cannon fodder gather rate super low. You're super poor in the early game when you're Yap, and your objective is to just make your opponent poor as well, by killing their units with a chopper, hopefully getting a mine detonation. And really, if you can get a mine detonation with Yap, that is a super massive blessing for you, because that solves some of your eco problems, because you get 2 more free units that can gather for you. The issue is that doesn't happen so much anymore. years ago, when people weren't quite as skilled when it came to early pathing with their units, they were much more liable to just... That was neat. My mic just cut off while I was talking. As I was saying, back in the day, people were more liable to just run their units into a mine. That doesn't happen quite as much anymore, and so that hurts Yap as well. But, I mean, you still have Beam, you still have super strong heroes on Tech 2. Strong Drop. Grunt Dome is a really good leader power. You have a good late game. Comboing Beam with Methane is super strong. I just find that another big weakness of his is mobility. Having to split up your goblins kind of hurts, because when they're in a pack, they're stronger than any other hero unit. But when you split them up, I mean, they lose a whole lot of their utility. And oftentimes that's what you have to do when you're dealing with someone who knows how to exploit your weaknesses. Just being all over the place, I think Yap really struggles to keep up in that kind of situation. Also, if you're going to be playing with methane wagons, those are expensive units. They're really good units, but expensive. And having to build a bunch of them and have them in different places, it's just a lot. And oftentimes not super feasible. Still a very good leader, and I do think some people may underrate him. I don't think he's like Decimus tier. I think he's definitely better. But I don't know. Maybe Vortis may be better than Yap. I don't know. But this is where I would put him. This is where my heart says to put him, even though I don't play him a whole lot. But moving on, I think the next leader is Arby. I think I'd put him in the same tier as Yap. My decision with Arby has kind of changed. I used to think he was the worst banished, but that was just because I'm really bad with him, and I'm still really bad with him. But I kind of recognize that more now that Pavium is one of my stronger leaders. Arbiter is one of my weaker leaders, but that doesn't mean that Arby is worse than Pavium. That doesn't make sense. You have a super strong Tech 2 hero, you have the best late game in the game, you have Phantoms, which are an amazing unit, Enforcers are an amazing unit, you have Ghosts, so your Tech 1 can't be that bad, and Stasis, you have double Stasis. Just being able to cancel out half their army in the middle of an engagement is very big. And Conduit, it gets good very quickly. I'd say once you have Conduit 2, just Stasis Mines as well. People kind of sleep on Stasis Mines because that's a stasis in itself once you get Conduit level 2. And he's just pretty solid. Having Elite Grunts is a super big bonus. And I do like my my Brute Grunts for their mines. It's nice to have that. The Elite Grunts are just, in the first few minutes of the game, which are the most vital moments, they're just better. They're more responsive, they're faster, and they actually take nodes when you tell them to. That's big. So Arby, definitely I had him underrated by at least a little bit in the past. Next, I would actually put Colony. I think Colony, some people might say he's as high as like the third best leader. I think that's a bit crazy. I would have probably said that before I played him more. And I still don't have a great Colony, but I've put a good amount of time into playing Colony. And he just doesn't quite have the same plays that like Decimus does with Dark Skies, because he has Goliaths. And people love Goliaths, but I would rather have Jump Pack Brutes. They're just way less expensive. When you lose a Goliath that has a skit on it, you're losing so many resources. And you have to think, like, is it worth it? And oftentimes, well, it is worth it, because you're like running at a hero with a bunch of skitted Goliaths, and you kill it and you win. On the flip side, if the scenario is a little bit different and they manage to survive and you lose your stuff, there's just absolutely no recovery for you because that army you lost was so expensive. I also think the Tech 2 at around like the 4th point mark is very awkward for Colony. I don't know if it's just me. I've just always felt that way. Like I said, not having the option to go Dark Skies is weird. You do have the Tech 2 Skitterer upgrade, which is very strong, but it's not quite the same. I don't think building Goliaths when you're in Tech 2 is a super good option either, so you're just kind of left to build counter units, which I think feels bad. But of course, once you hit 5th point with Combat Repair, 6th point with Dev Host, you're very, very strong. It's just kind of awkward for a little bit, and that's why I would knock him down from these top 2 tiers. Still a very strong leader. I mean, not many weaknesses at all. Skits are great. You have a heal. Goliath drop is great. Teleport's nice to have. All that, but just not quite at the pinnacle. Next, I would say, is Cutter. I would put Cutter here. I think Cutter is very good. Actually, I'd put him in the same tier as Colony. I think he's the number 4 though, while Colony is the number 5. Ease of use is huge, and Cutter is just absolutely brain dead. You can put your brain in a microwave and put it on popcorn mode, and you'll still be able to play Cutter, because all you have to do is really spam and send your units places and rush your leader powers and use your drops, and there's just not much to it. Taking nodes quickly is great. Fast infantry, obviously great. Your drops are all good, and I'd say they're a bit more. They offer more utility than Cansano's drops, where hers are a little bit more specific. Like, you get flamethrowers in your big drop, kind of weird. Cutter, I think his drops are a bit more useful, like ODSTs. You can keep them alive all game just for that Y ability, and that's always great to have. You just don't have many weaknesses. Not many at all. Like, I struggle to name one. He obviously has bad matchups, but not many. I think, like, Arby can be a bad matchup. He can struggle with Desi if he gets 4th point, like I said, but you can also kill him easily before that. But other than that, he dies to ship. He dies to Forge a lot, but he can beat Forge, kind of map dependent. Trox can also be an issue. But these are all leaders that are... I haven't ranked them yet, so these are the top tier leaders in my opinion. I would put, next, I would put Trox. I think Trox is just solid. Like Cutter, except he's banished. Except you can kind of play him like he's a UNSC, which is nice, because that Tech 1 UNSC aggression is pretty potent, and Trox can do the exact same thing, and then also have a super clean transition into the mid and late game with cheap buildings, well, bases that is, and turrets and shields and cheap fortify, and it's just super horrible to deal with if you're UNSC and you don't have the building killers that Banished do. And other Banished, obviously, still struggle with Trox because of the Chosen is just an amazing unit. Oftentimes you can just crutch it in Tech 2, get a fast Tech 3, and just run around with Marauders and whatever counter units they build, you just eat them with your Chosen. And of course you also have a strong Dark Skies play available to you, so diversity is another factor in this, and Trox is quite nice when it comes to diversity of builds and options afforded to you. Also, the noobs who think Decimus Banshees are the best thing in the world don't know that Trox Banshees are better. Of course, you have to be more late game. Once you're like 120 pop, Dying Breath just works its wonders, and those are the strongest Banshees in the game, in my opinion. But yeah, it's pretty obvious why Trox is good. Just super solid. You can cancel leader powers. Unbreakable is also very nice. Expensive, but very nice. Erad is kind of like a more expensive Inferno, but it's more useful on units, just hard to land. Your late game, also one of the best in the game. Not quite top tier like Isabel and Arbiter, but he's up there. Definitely up there. Next, in the God tier, Sergeant Forge. I guess it took me a little bit to come around to Forge being one of the best leaders, you know, like top 2. But I did come around. The heavy metal Forge Hog being super hard to kill on Tech 1, being able to get a super fast Kodiak drop with rolling eco, scatter bomb, you know, lag bomb, people getting better with aiming it, with understanding the northwest mechanic. Yeah, I don't have a good Forge, obviously. I'd say I have a better, like, Trox, Cutter. I don't really play Ship or Forge all that much, but Forge does have the benefit of being very straightforward. It's very strong to have like an infantry play and then use your vehicle drops that they just can't counter. But of course you can still play vehicles because you have assembly. The Forge Hog continues to be an amazing unit in Tech 2 and then just becomes utterly invincible in Tech 3. And Grizzly drop is great for sniping bases. Kodiak drop is always good, and especially if you get level 2, I think that's kind of slept on. Just Vet 2 Kodiaks. If you get that stacked just twice, you can say goodbye to any ground units. It's just not even an option at that point. So his late game is another big thing. It's kind of equivalent to Trox's, I'd say. Oftentimes you'll see Trox and Forge in that matchup. It goes late a lot of the time, and it just ends up looking like a stalemate. Your Vulture play is really good because you have the super strong eco, kind of like with Johnson, except you have it all game because your eco point is your first point, not your 5th point. And your hero complements it very well on top of that. So super strong, definitely without any doubt the best UNSC leader in the game. But the number 1 is still the same, and that is Shipmaster. Like Arbiter, you have Elite Grunts, but on top of that you have Raid, so you get your nodes even quicker. Your tech timing can be just utterly insane. Your hero is likewise insane. You have multiple get out of jail free cards. You have Cloak, forcing them to have Detect. If they don't have Detect, then you just can't do anything. And then you also have Extract, which not only saves and heals your hero, but it also heals your front 4 pads, making him very, very hard to do any kind of early aggression on. Raid 2 Ghosts are another good option, but teching and Honor Guard I typically prefer. Beam, good leader power. Spirit Support, one of the best leader powers in the game. Displace, one of the best leader powers in the game. And you just have amazing mobility. Raid 2 Wraiths. I feel like that change that made Raid 3 into Raid 2, that was a mistake. Because those Raid 2 Wraiths are actually just wacky. Like, you might think Desi Wraiths are good because, oh, you have so many passives. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you'll never catch Shipmaster Wraiths. You just won't. You can't. Even if you somehow do, they have multiple options to get out. They have Extract, they have Teleport, they can just run away, they have Tactical Gateway. I mean, the mobility options with Ship are really great, and of course he has a really good late game. He's not weak at any point in the game. Honor Guard or Ghost can carry you early on. You can get a very quick Spirit Support, and from there it gets worse and worse playing against him. It's horrible. Uh, Everyone hates this leader, and for a good reason. It's just fact, demonstrable. You can demonstrate it very easily that this leader just has amazing matchups against almost every other leader. Forge, I think he actually rose up the ranks to be a ship counter, and only later did people realize his merits against everyone else. So it's nice that you kind of have a UNSC to balance out ship, but I say balance, but it's not really balanced at all. But that is the tier list. So I suppose I have to rank all these units. Alright, so we've moved on to the units, and I guess I'll just go in the random order I have them in. I reserve the right to move them around as I kind of place them where I think generally they should go. The first unit here is the Elite Ranger. I feel like these units are just kind of overshadowed by Suicide Grunts. They cost a whole lot more, and sure, they do their job without having to sacrifice themselves, but they do their job much more slowly, less efficiently. They're countered by other units, basically any other unit other than an infantry unit. And if you're dealing with a big blob of infantry, you need a lot of them. And that just leaves you very vulnerable to, like I said, any other unit type. I just much prefer Suicide Grunts because they will clear out a big infantry ball at the drop of a hat. They require your opponent to split and micro, whereas Rangers, sure, there's also micro you can do to mitigate these guys as well. I find the shots to be very easily wiggleable, and that's not a word, but you know what I mean. You can wiggle out of them pretty easily, and I just find these units are super vulnerable, and while they do their job okay, I just don't think they do it well enough to be any higher than like a B tier. Next, this is the Cutter's hero, Jerome. I'll probably put him in like C+. He's the weakest Spartan out of the three, Anders, Isabel, and Cutter. He just struggles a lot versus like squad units like Grunts and Marines. Obviously he's the same on Tech 1, and so that's fine, but the Tech 2 upgrade, oftentimes you don't even get, because as Cutter you'd rather have an infantry upgrade or 2 more extra upgraded pads. He just doesn't do all that much for you. His DPS is not it. Next is the Cyclops. I'll probably put the Cyclops in the C tier. They're only really usable when you're Cutter, because it's nice to have them be quick. They can actually kind of keep up with vehicles better, as well as you have that Vet 2 Cyclops drop, which is super nice to have. The thing is, with other leaders, they're just not usable. They bunch up a lot of the time, so if you're fighting like Wraiths, you're gonna get scorched, they're gonna die, and sure, the Tech 3 upgrade is pretty nice, the slow is nice, that still doesn't remedy their weaknesses, and really, UNSC should be focused on spamming their own core units instead of building counter units. And they can build counter units, but this is one of their weaker options. I think snipers are a good counter unit, but generally UNSC do lack strong counter units, and this is a prime example. Next is the Voridus hero. I'll probably put him in B tier. Not a great hero. I think I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about Voridus. He's not super strong, but the thing is, he's super useful. Utility is something we need to consider, and you really need a way to spread goo when you're playing Vortis, especially around that 3rd point timing when you want to set up a big invig. Your only other option at this point in the game is using Grenadier Drop, and that's only going to make a little puddle. And most of the time when you use Grenadier Drop, you want to suck that goo back up in order to give the Grenadier that buff. So I think he's pretty essential to playing Vortis. You just need that goo, and while he's not a great unit, it's just kind of a sacrifice you need to make. You have to get him out on the field in order to get that goo on the ground. Kinsano's Cyclops is next. I think this is more of like a B+. Not usable at all on Tech 1, like I mentioned earlier as well. But once you hit Tech 2, this thing is just a pain to play against. Unfortunately, Kinsano being a weak leader, it feels like it's tough to get this thing out and upgraded, because you're just struggling to keep your head above water and you can't really afford it. You're trying to afford units, you're trying to afford drops, and maybe you're trying to get up an expo, and it's hard to fit this thing in. But as a unit, it is powerful, and once you get it to Tech 3, it's even more annoying. Just a great harassment unit, super annoying to play against, and that's why I would put it above like Vortis or Jerome, even though it lacks Tech 1 utility. Next is the Suicide Grunt, and I'm going to put this in S tier. Like I said, I love Suicide Grunts. I think they're some of the best units in the game. Super under abused. I think people should be spamming these units more often. Whenever you're against any UNSC and they're trying to go infantry, you can always shut it down completely if you double pump Suis at them. Because yeah, they can split, but they're not a computer. They're a human. They can't possibly split perfectly. And sure, you're losing out on some resources if they do a pretty good job of mitigating the damage, but it doesn't really matter. Sure, you might be losing out on a few resources, but if you wipe their infantry ball, it doesn't really matter. They no longer have an army on the field, and they're no longer a problem. I think you also have a teleport option. You can teleport them into a big ball, and that's just completely undodgeable. I think their Tech 3 upgrade is super underused. Once again, just completely shuts down any infantry play even later on into the game. I think Banshee Sui is also an underused unit composition. On Tech 3, that is. You get the Plasma Torpedo, you get new recruits, and they just can't... Damn cat. Scratching up the sofa. Yeah, they underutilized, shuts down any infantry play if you use them correctly. Very oppressive unit, and I know I keep saying they're underused, but I may be shooting myself in the foot because I like playing UNSC, I like building infantry, but if more people know about this, they know they can just shut it down completely. So, S tier unit, definitely. Next is the Marine. I'll probably put it in the B tier. Very useful as cutter. Forge as well can go for CT plays with the Kodiak drop, and that can be strong. Johnson sometimes goes for CT with the Bunker 2 play. Other than that though, a lot of UNSC don't really go for Marines. I mean, Kinsano does have the redline glitch. When you get CT, it reactivates redline, and that's cool, but kind of a gimmick. And if your opponent knows about it, it's kind of a telegraphed move. But they're useful. Not a weak unit. Just situationally, I think they're more niche than a lot of people would think. Hogs are generally a better option. And next is the Retriever. I don't know if I want to put this in A or A+. I think I'm going to drop it in A for now. Expensive and can be a liability, but other than that, great for controlling the map. keeping your opponent pinned on defense and buying up the rest of the map while they just kind of have to sit there. Shield is obviously a great benefit for this unit. Hit and run tactics are a must. Very annoying to play against. It seems like you need a massive population of Reaver to deal with it, and then you become more susceptible to the rest of the army, like Kodiaks or Warthogs. And of course, that also synergizes quite well with having a Spartan leader who can just hijack Reavers on repeat, and you're just bleeding out power when you're playing against this thing, as long as it's microed correctly. So, very good unit. Next is the Warthog. I'll probably put this in A+. Like I said, usually a better option than the Marine because of speed and I think combat efficiency as well. A lot of micro can go into them. Even when you're playing against hunters, you can kind of strafe side to side and dodge a lot of shots. It's kind of big that the units that counter it are pretty inaccurate. And then for the UNSC, the unit that counters it just isn't a good unit. So that all kind of helps the Warthog be strong. At the same time, a lot of leaders have buffs for these units, like the Forgehog Aura is nice. Vehicle Assembly that Forge has and Isabel has both help in making Warthogs even better units. Next is the Flamethrower. I'll probably put it in the C+ tier. Not quite as useless as Cyclops, but I really struggle to find a usage for them outside of Tech 1. Pretty niche. I'd say Dispersion really is not an amazing upgrade. Maybe a bit overrated by some people. It does help the issue they have with not doing a lot of damage to buildings, even though they're kind of labeled as a anti-building unit. They're not at all. But Dispersion, it doesn't stand up to Rangers, doesn't stand up to Suis either. The only real usage for getting that upgrade is if you're playing against someone who's just spamming Decimus Grunts at you. Then it becomes a absolute asset, and it's just required. But other than that, they're useful on Tech 1 for dealing with Grunts, but outside of that, not much use. Next is the Johnson Hero. I'd probably put it in the same tier as the Kinsano Hero. Just having that bunker, I mentioned it earlier, is nice because it gives you a second life. The issue is I don't rate it as highly as like the Forgehog or the Honor Guard because bunkers do only have 7,000 HP, and a lot of the time you can easily roll them over. But sometimes you can't just bulldoze them, and the hero gets away, and that sucks. So that's why I would place him this high. He also deals with scout units well, and while he's not as fast as a Chosen, he has the same DPS as a Chosen. Another thing is he doesn't have the slow the Chosen has, so obviously I'm not rating him as high as the Chosen, but DPS wise he is pretty good. Next is the Scorpion. I'm thinking maybe a D+. It's just slow, bad pathing, bulky units, and they'd be good units if not for the fact that leader powers are such a big factor in Halo Wars 2. Any AoE leader power that does a lot of damage, like an Eradication or a Mac Blast or an upgraded Beam, there's not much counterplay. You have your own leader powers, like that's why with Isabel, even outside of the best offense, they're a good option because you have heal heavy metal. But not all leaders have that available to them, and often you're just building these slow, expensive units that just get wiped, and you can't afford to refield them. They perform well generally against other units, pretty much against anything other than air, but that vulnerability to leader powers really just holds them back. Next is the highest rated hero, I would say, so far. Probably an A tier hero. It is Alice. Like I said earlier when I was talking about Isabel, this is just the best Spartan hero because of the chain gun. Volatile Scarab, I think I'll put in A+ tier. Being able to spread goo all over the place is very nice. It makes Cataclysm almost inescapable, which is kind of an issue I have with Vortis, that Cataclysm can be hard to land. A lot of leaders have good ways of mitigating it, and the Scarab counteracts a lot of counterplay, because it's so hard to get away from the goo. Wherever you shoot, you're spreading it. And you do have less HP than a regular Scarab, but that's okay. You can build Engies with it, you have Invigorating Frenzy, you still have that invulnerability shield, and it's more than worth it for the trade-off you get for the extra goo. I think this is another S tier unit, the Colossus. The difference between the Colossus and the tank is the range, kiting ability, the fact you have an invulnerability, and they are expensive, but Johnson can afford it because of free buildings. You also have Pelican, and that helps a ton with the mobility issues that you get with these Scorpions. So all of the weaknesses of the Scorpions are negated, and plus you get that kiting ability that the Scorpions just don't have. If Johnson gets into these, it doesn't really matter what leader you're playing as, it's going to be an issue for you. A lot of the time your best option is to just get mass air and hope they don't have enough Wolverine mixed into their unit composition to deal with it. Okay, this is the Wraith Invader. I'm thinking maybe a C, C or C+. Give me a moment here. Yeah, like the Mastodon, it takes a lot of micromanagement to be putting units into them and making sure the units have the proper upgrades, and that's all very annoying. The same thing applies to the Phantom, and you'll see I will place the Phantom very differently, but for a different list of reasons. I do think they're a bit more flimsy than people think. They think, oh well, they have a siphon and they have a shield, but their HP bar isn't huge. They're about equivalent with a Mastodon, I'd say, despite having that shield and siphon. Don't let that get it twisted in your head. It's nice to be able to put your Pavium hero in it and negate his slow movement speed, but I don't really find an issue with Pavium's hero being slow. When you play Pavium, oftentimes you have to play pretty methodically and work up to a big Lich push, and Pavium will often just be sitting on defense, so it's not an issue anyway. So I don't see much of a reason to go for these, especially because you just have better options. Burnout 3, Rain of Fire, your Enduring Will heal, all better options than Wraith Invaders. Next, these are Enforcers, probably an A+ unit. Just having ranged Tech 1 building killers, that is incredible. The Tech 2 upgrade also I think is a bit underused. It's pretty nice. Of course you have the drop as well, which automatically has that upgrade on them, and they're vet, and they get conduit put on them, and they'll strip your base in a matter of seconds. One big issue with them though is that they tend to prioritize air units. I've had games that I lose because I'm targeting down in expansion base, and then like a Hornet flies in or something, and it doesn't matter how much I spam X on the base, the Enforcers just don't listen, and they just shoot at the air unit, and you're just sunk. But they offer a lot of Tech 1 utility. I think in a good amount of matchups they're oppressive, especially on smaller maps, and Aatrox, he likes to do this cheese where he just buys his own mini, puts a Rax on it immediately, and just walks across the entire map. And you'd think that, well, if you have to walk across the entire map, then surely you can deal with it, right? But unless you scout it coming, unless you see it coming, it can actually be very difficult to hold. I remember watching a series of Aatrox versus Almirante, and it was Arby versus Forge. Forge, of course, one of the best leaders in the game, oftentimes considered to be unrushable just because of that early eco that Rolling Economy grants him. But Aatrox kind of proved that wrong, just walking across the map with Enforcers, getting a huge pop of them early on. They are not to be slept on. Also, their Y ability, useful for locking down heroes or turrets, that kind of thing. If you're doing a rush with them, like a common rush on Frontiers to buy the middle mini, put a Rax on it, and just spam Enforcers at their base, and you can stop a hero 5th build. Oftentimes, just throwing your stasis grenades at the armory until you can have more of a pop, and that's useful for just delaying. Next is the Hunter. I want to put it in B+ tier. I think they're a better unit than the Ranger, but at the same time they fall into the same trap as the Ranger, where they're a very power heavy unit, slow, and only really do one thing. But I think they do that one thing better than the Ranger does. They kill vehicles better than the Ranger kills infantry, and because of that I'd put them higher. Still don't want to be spamming them, but once again, unlike the Ranger, I don't think you actually need a lot of them for them to do their job. With Rangers, it seems you need a healthy pop of them for them to actually overcome the mass infantry. Whereas with Hunters, you can have like 2 of them, have some NGs above them, and if they try and fight you, they're going to be trading horribly. But of course you need a good amount of awareness in the game in order to use them correctly. They're slow, you need to position them well, and building them without engineers is just a death sentence because they're a big investment. They're not cheap units, and you need those NGs to keep them alive, otherwise you're just bleeding out resources. Next is Pavium. I'd put him in the same tier as Voridus. Like I said, he's slow, but that Y ability is super nice, very long ranged, good for killing other heroes or slowing groups of enemies and then comboing it with like a Rain of Fire. He's also nice to put in a garrison. He's got long range, so he can shell from quite a distance. And also the debuff that applies when he shoots anything. I believe that's the Tech 2 upgrade. That's quite nice as well, especially when you're trying to target down a base with like a Lich push or something. So, offers a good amount of utility, just not quite as much as some other hero units, mainly because of the mobility issue, but largely that is counteracted by Pavium's playstyle in the first place. You kind of can just sit them in a garrison and forget about it for the most part. Yeah, these are Cryo Troopers. I would put them above the Hellbringers because they're just a bit more useful. I mentioned when I was talking about Serena how you want to put them on hold position next to mini bases, and that is super annoying for the enemy to deal with. Just freezing your pads, building them in combination with the Bison, getting that extra freeze. You have a freeze aura on them. In regards to fighting units, I believe they're kind of comparable with the Flamethrower, but you have the added bonus of being able to slow down your opponent's economy, and I'd say that's their main usefulness, not so much fighting other units. And past Tech 1, you really shouldn't be building them, much like the Flamer, And also, much like the Flamer, their Tech 2 upgrade isn't really worthwhile. It's also cheaper than dispersion nozzles, but still not really worthwhile. Honor Guard is an S tier hero unit. Cloak, Extract, I think he has like a 22 movement speed, just completely insane. I don't know why he's that fast. It's stupid. This is like the dumbest unit in the game. Please nerf. Stupid unit. A lot of micro can go into it to make it very annoying to deal with. And yeah, I mean, just play against a shipmaster who has good honor guard micro and tell me it's not infuriating. And that's that. Jump Pack Brutes, another S tier unit. These are the best building killer unit in the game. A whole lot of mobility with their jump ability on like Bedrock. Being able to jump behind people's bases is nice. Imagine any other map, any high ground, you can jump up, jump down, escape from enemies, or get to their base and start whacking down pads. But largely what makes them the best building killer unit is their Tech 2 upgrade Dark Skies, which is the single best upgrade in the game. Adding another member to the squad, making their health bars massive, improving their already tremendous damage, and they don't really get countered, especially when you're playing Decimus, by Rangers, which are supposed to counter them. They're cheap as well. That's another big factor. When we talk about Goliaths, when you lose them, it hurts a lot because you can't really afford to just be spamming them. That's very expensive. Jump Pack Brutes, on the other hand, I'll often build like 5 or even 6 Raxes when I'm spamming these things. And you can afford it just fine. They're just tremendously cheap. Some of the best units in the game, if not the best unit. I may argue that Decimus Jump Pack Brutes are the best unit in the game. Phantom, another S tier unit. Unlike the other garrison units, these things fly, and they're also an Arbiter unit, so Conduit applies to them. And once you have Conduit level 3 and a bunch of procs, they're just utterly invincible. There is no answer to the Phantom Death Ball once RB properly gets into them. Of course, they do require that same kind of management, but in the end, you get so much more value out of them than the Wraith Invader or the Mastodon. Just because of that scaling potential, the fact that they don't have any mobility issues. It's also nice to be able to put enforcers in them and fly around the map with flying building killers. Next, the Frostraven. I'd put it probably in the B tier. They can be nice for dealing with scout spam on Tech 1. Oftentimes that's the bane of your existence when you're playing Serena, because the Bison is vulnerable to a bunch of rams, and these are nice for counteracting that a little bit. They don't really do much damage, but once you get a good mass of them, they will freeze units very, very quickly. And the Y abilities obviously are a great thing to have. But I do think they may be a little under... Okay, my mic really seems to not be able to tell when I'm using it and when I'm not, because it just keeps going out. But yeah, Frostraven, B tier unit, and I was gonna say maybe a little bit underused because of that reason, that they counter scouts rather well. And when you get a mass of them, they are not bad at all. Locust, I don't know. I feel like Locusts are overshadowed by the infantry building killer units. They're just expensive, slow, and the only thing they really have going for them is the range. And I don't think it's worth it, because fast-moving units like the Warthog can get behind them, kill them. Sacrificing a few Warthogs to get a Locust kill is worth it, because they're 200 power and 300 supply. Just more expensive than they need to be. Compare that to a jump pack brute, and it's just like, why would you build these? If you're playing as anyone who has jump pack brutes, you don't need to build these. Unless you're in a situation like you're against Serena and you need to push a base that has the watchtowers on them. That's more annoying and may require a Locust, and that's why they're not super low. They do have niche situations. Some people like to play ship by teleporting these things around. I just think that's a more difficult style than just spamming your super fast wraiths, and you're more liable to get punished because they don't have the mobility that wraiths do. This is one of the Omega Team Spartans. I know there's like, what, August and Leon and then another one. I forget the name, and I think that's this one. I would probably just drop them in B tier. It's the equivalent of a Tech 2 Spartan, but nothing exactly special about it. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road Spartan unit. Engineer is another S tier unit. 40% damage reduction, that's all I have to say. They're cheap. The healing rate, absolutely insane. 40% damage reduction, don't know how that never got nerfed. Yeah, I shouldn't really have to explain this placement too much. Jackrabbit, probably a B tier unit. They're quick. Some leaders do better with them than others. Cutters can capture nodes, that's nice. Kinsano has good rabbits. Jerome has good rabbits. I do feel, though, that infantry is almost always a better option, because the main drawback is that these don't have a Tech 2 upgrade. So when you have a big mass of them and you go Tech 2, there's no way to upgrade them and have them continue to be useful to you. Whereas if you're spamming Marines, you can upgrade them into CT and they're still useful. So I think people are getting better at dealing with the kind of Jackrabbit hit and run style, where you run around and try and hit down mini bases and then go away and hit somewhere else. That is still annoying, and that's still good on certain maps. I just think the weakness is in that Tech 2 transition. Chosen, S tier, for obvious reasons. Range, damage, slow, speed. He is speed. The amount of times you'll see it Chosen just slip away when it's dead to rights, just, it happens so often. You also have teleport, you have bulwark, and he just doesn't die a lot of the time. He may be easier to kill than an honor guard, but that's not saying much, because an honor guard is like impossible to kill. If this thing gets vetted up, oftentimes, if you do end up winning the game, you still don't kill the Chosen. Vet 3 Chosen just won't die unless your opponent is just being negligent. And I think anyone who's ever played against a well-micro Chosen understands why he would be placed this high. I think Grunts, also like the Marine, a B tier unit. I think their Tech 2 upgrade is much less useful than combat tech. That said, their Tech 1 upgrade is way more useful than Grenade Throw, because unlike Grenade Throw, they actually do their job and they counter scout units, because they don't miss like the grenades do. They also do more damage against buildings, which is nice if you're going to be playing as Voridus or as Pavium and you're going to do that Rain of Fire kind of cheese. So they offer more options on Tech 1, just Tech 2, not as good. But I think that balances them out, and they both belong in the same tier. Next, the Wolverine. I'd say C+ is fair. They're not as useless as the Cyclops. Oftentimes you need them, you can't not build them, but it sucks because you don't want to build them because they're not good units. Compared to the Reaver, they have no Y ability. The micro is not. There's less of a micro skill ceiling with Reavers. You can just go in a circle, dodge every shot. Wolverines just don't have that option, and they're expensive for what they are as well. But you just need them. You need them if your opponent's building air. You can't not build them. And they do their job. It's just they don't do it that well. It's kind of passable, but I wouldn't give it any other praise other than passable. So that's why I think C+ is a good rating. Another S tier unit. You might notice a trend. The only S tier UNSC unit so far is the Colossus. All the others are banished. This is the Skitterer. S tier because, well, Skit Chopper at the beginning of the game, absolutely oppressive. The Skit Blob that Colony builds, absolutely oppressive, especially when you get that Tech 2 upgrade. I think it's like a 50% DPS upgrade. So if you're not spamming these things, you're not playing Colony right. They are one of the essentials of Colony's kit. And once again, I think it's just kind of a self-explanatory placement. Douglas, I would also put in A tier. I think Alice is slightly better, but unlike Jerome here, he is quite useful, especially against air, and that synergizes pretty well with the Anders playstyle. When you're going Kodiaks, it's nice to have something other than these kind of just passable Wolverines in order to deal with air, especially because you have a little micro thing you can do, just going back and forth and shooting rapid fire at air units. Very nice to have. And overall, quite a good unit. Hard to kill, especially when you're having to deal with a Retriever and Hogs and Kodiaks. He just fits in very well with the army. Kodiaks, probably another A tier unit. Not always something you want to be building with every single UNSC leader, but I did bring up earlier how they can kind of cover the shortcomings of Cansano, of Johnson, and obviously they're a great choice when you're playing Serena, and especially Anders. So I do think I wouldn't quite place them in the same tier as Warthogs, because Warthogs just have that harassment potential. They don't quite have the same base pushing potentials as Kodiaks, but at the same time they don't require quite as much micro, and they offer strengths in other areas. And these units, you can't just be spamming them. They're expensive. They require you to have a good amount of anti-air, because if you get caught with your pants down, you're just going to get wiped by air, and at that point you just resign. But when used well and set up intelligently, not just like sitting next to each other so that they can be murdered with one leader power, they are very effective units, and I think A tier is a good placement for them. Now the Heavy Grunt, I don't know if I should put it in B or B+, because they offer something that these the Marine and the Grunt don't, which is their Y ability. Just a full-on stun. Earlier I was complaining about how they can stun the Retriever, and they only cost 120 resources, which is more than a Grunt, less than a Marine, but when paired with methane wagons, they are way more cost efficient than a Marine. Or a Grunt for that matter, or a lot of units. So I'm not really sure if it should go in this B+ category. or just the B category, because I do think Yap, oftentimes he'll mix this into his Tech 1 army comp, but you don't really see a whole lot of upgraded heavy grunt plays at a high level. Partially because of the weakness of Yap being having to be all over the map, and these guys really like to have methane on them, and that is not always feasible. But I feel like B+, just slightly, that Y ability puts them slightly above the other two core infantry units. I'd say just barely. Their health bars also get insane when you get their upgrades. This is the Reaver, another S tier unit, another banished S tier unit. Like I said, all you have to do is go in a circle, you dodge every shot, and they have a jump ability, good range, good damage, you have a shield. It's just like, I don't know what they were thinking when they designed these two units, the Wolverine and the Reaver. They just decided, yeah, we're just going to make the Reaver a million times better in every way. You can kill so many air units with just a single Reaver. It's not even fair. I think this is Jerome, the Commander Jerome. I'd probably put him in C+. Just very slow. I pretty much already talked about him. His Y ability is nice, comboing with mines. Kind of predictable though, you can often split out of it. And yeah, I kind of already highlighted his weaknesses. He's very strong once he's Tech 3. Once again, issue is getting there. I'd put the Scarab in A tier, a bit lower than the Volatile Scarab, but still a good option often. The Scarab does well against Wraiths for the most part, unless we're talking high numbers and vehicle upgrades. Oftentimes, if your enemy tries to get away with just spamming Wraith against a Scarab, they're gonna die. They try and just skip Hunter, and you can't do that. You need to build Hunters against this thing. Invulnerability Shield is great. You can combo it with Engineers. Unlike the Vortis Scarab, something nice about the regular Scarab is you have Engineers that have the 40% damage reduction. Obviously, great to have. Cannon Fodder, I'll probably drop in B tier. Before people kind of pointed out their gathering issues, I would have probably put them higher, because they are free units, and that's nice, but they don't gather quickly at all. The vision is nice, but oftentimes you can't afford to take all the minis you want to take, and you end up just sacking them, whacking at a generator, and sometimes they're a liability because you don't want to fill your pop with them, and when you do, you have to get rid of them, and you just end up vetting up an enemy hero, and then that's an issue for you later on. Their what is it, Ankle Biters is actually quite a good upgrade. It gives them the same DPS as a Grunt Squad for free units, which is crazy. But the problem is in that Yap really wants to spend his power on Tech 2 on getting those goblins, getting an Expo, getting a 3rd gen. Those are all higher priority than upgrading your cannon fodder. The Flamehog, yeah, I was complaining about this thing earlier. I'll put it in C+. It's not quite this C tier level bad, because they do quite well against infantry, and they're good harassment units, but in the grand scheme of things, they just pale in comparison to regular Warthogs, and they present Kinsano with one of her biggest weaknesses, that is to just core vehicle spam. Not an amazing unit. The Bison, A or A plus? I think A plus probably. Being able to lock down an economy completely, just completely freeze it. On Tech 3, that radius is just huge. Its health bar is huge, has a good heal rate, so it's good to pair with like Combat Tech Marines that you can just keep healing it with. Just a good hero unit. Not the quickest in the world, but it's okay because the stuff it shoots at it slows, so often it can just get away by slowing the enemy. It doesn't really have to be a fast unit in itself. Grenadier, I'd say also an A plus unit. I don't like it as much as the Sui, but I do see its merits. Spreading goo is nice. They do good damage against infantry. They don't do well against heroes, and that's one of my gripes with them. Suicide Grunts, you can spam them and just send them right into a Spartan. That Spartan's gonna die. Grenadiers don't work the same way. They're very slow, and they get popped pretty easily by Suicide Grunts and by Jackrabbits as well. So they have their weaknesses, but the nice thing is that even if you do lose them and you don't get as much done as you'd like to, you always have the benefit of spreading goo, and that's always nice. This is the Command Mantis, I believe. I'd put this above the Jerome Hero unit because of the kiting potential, and that's pretty much it. I don't think I have to elaborate a ton. The Wraith, I don't know if it's S or A plus. Probably S. I mean, it's like a Scorpion, except it actually has mobility. Yeah, Scorch, great ability. Oftentimes, the late game banished unit composition is just unendingly Wraith, Reaver, Engineer. Either that or you go Banshee, and it's very strong. I mean, how many high-level games do we have to see of just people spamming Wraiths at each other? It's obviously one of the best units in the game. Goliath, I'm going to put in A tier, I'd say. Like I said, the weakness is their cost. They have a good amount of health, and it gets better when you put skits on them, but it really hurts when you lose them. A lot of the time, when you're playing Colony, you just want to get a bunch of them, get a bunch of skits on them, and while that can strip a base very quickly, like I've already brought up multiple times, they really hurt to lose. Now the Warlord, I've already kind of expressed my distaste for the Warlord, but I will put it in B tier because it cancels out other heroes, and that's a nice tool to have. Of course, it on its own doesn't really cancel out other heroes, at least on Tech 1. You need to be able to combo it with a Vortex. That's something I think people kind of overlook, the fact that just this unit alone won't do it. You need to also use a leader power. On Tech 2, that's no longer the case because you can stun just by hitting them, and you can micro it so that whatever you're hitting just can't ever get away. And that's cool. Next, the Chopper. I'm going to put it in A+. The Chopper has been a staple of the meta for many years now. It's the bane of UNSC a lot of the time, especially in the first few minutes of the game, where the goal of the Chopper is to hunt down all the UNSC starting units. And often it can get that done with extreme efficiency, just kind of wiggling from side to side, dodging any attacks. Very microable, has a nice ram ability. It's just clear why this is a good unit. Grizzlies I would put in the same tier as Scorpions for all the same reasons. I think they might be slightly better actually because Forge has that double assembly making them much cheaper and they have more HP. but their Y ability is actually completely useless. It does less DPS than if you're just shooting regularly, which is a weakness compared to the canister shell, which is actually a good ability. But yeah, it makes sense these would be in the same tier. This is the Brute Rider, and I'd drop it in the same tier as the Goliath. The issue is that compared to the Jump Pack Brute, they don't have that jump, and they don't have a good Tech 2 upgrade. Whereas the Dark Skies upgrade upgrades both the damage and health of your unit. The Punch Harder You upgrade only upgrades your damage, so it's not an option on Tech 2. It's nice they throw the grenades, and that can be good. Once again, easy to wiggle out of though. And the Ram is nice. Like with the Goliath, it's good for closing gaps, but they share the same weaknesses in that they're more expensive than a unit that they're just inherently worse than because of mobility issues and the fact that you're not going to be building them on Tech 2. And the Arbiter, S tier. Tech 1, not so much, but once you're Tech 2, that health bar is huge. The Siphon on Rage is massive. It's very hard to kill this thing. It deals with other heroes very well. I'd say it deals with other heroes better than the Warlord does, because you don't really need to use a leader power in order to kill other heroes. Look at like a Chosen versus an Arbiter hero. The Arbiter will win. With micro, of course. But yeah, the Conduit proc is nice. Tech 3 just makes him even more tanky. Just a pain in the ass. Absolute pain in the ass. Have this guy running around the map, dropping in enforcers. You're never safe. Sentinel, Protector Sentinel, that is going to go in the D tier. Actually, as well as the Hornet. I think they're about the same. Hornets have, I think they do more DPS. Of course, once you have all the upgrades on this Protector Sentinels, I think they edge out the Hornet. They also have a Y ability stun, which is their greatest asset. The shield is absolutely required on them, because without them they're just absolutely made out of paper mache. And Hornets are down here because, I mean, what are you gonna do with them? The Reaver is one of the best units in the game. What are you gonna do with these? You can't do much. Wingmen may be a little bit slept on, but I mean, can you blame people? Vultures are an amazing option, and if you're Tech 3, it's hard to overlook Vulture when these things aren't amazing by themselves. Protector Sentinels, they do have kind of niche situations where they're good. I think they're good against Yap because of the fact that Yap needs to throw up a raid camp in order to build heavy grunts. Oftentimes he wants to be building killers instead, or spamming choppers or something. And the Y ability, like I said, great asset to have. Just the issue is their HP, super duper low. Next, Decimus drop, also known as the Cory drop or the Sasu drop. I drop him in A tier, maybe even A plus, because he is expensive, but that Y ability is great. He's tanky. Yeah, I think we can put him in A plus. The pull is good for dealing with high priority units. You can even pull a Scarab, and really the main factor is the Y ability, but he's just a massive damage sponge as well. If you're in a game where it's kind of one of those spam fests where you're sending units all over the map, just drop this on the enemy's base, and they won't have a big enough blob of units to deal with it, and it'll just infinitely be stripping their pads, being a nuisance. Not really just a nuisance, but a major problem that they have to come up with something in order to deal with. and these are ODSTs. I would put them in the A tier. Overall, they're not the most amazing unit, but what really makes them is the Y ability, and that alone puts them in A tier, I think. Raid, making them quick. You can get out of bad situations, keep them alive, heal them up, keep using that Y ability on repeat. Just a very strong unit. Allows for combos with like Spartan Slam. Just anyone who uses these knows they're good. Ghosts, I'd put in the same tier as the Chopper, even though the Micro is not as easy to do because they kind of just handle like cruise ships. But the shields are what makes them. If you go for the upgraded Ghosts, you're often going to be able to lock down the map easily, especially when playing against infantry. You just combo them with Suicide Grunts and you roll over anything. Of course, early on they don't have the same threat that Choppers have because, well, you can't just wiggle from side to side with them. They just kind of go in more of an arc, and they can't dodge fire as well as a Chopper can. The Grunt Goblin I'm going to put in the S tier. Sure, they're not an option on Tech 1, but once you do get that Tech 2 Shard Storm Launcher, they are the best hero unit in the game when you have the three of them. They out DPS every other hero unit. Maybe not the best in the game, but yes, they do have the best DPS when all three of them are together. 3 Bulwarks, amazing. If your opponent's lagging, you get more than 3 Bulwarks because they go off multiple times, and that's a massive pain. On top of that, they can drop a shield generator from the sky when they're playing Yap. So the sustainability of the Yap Death Ball is huge, and the Goblin is a big contributor to that. Absolutely essential part of the Yap army composition. Banshee, I'm going to put in A+ tier, I think. They're just better than Hornets in every way because their counter is the Wolverine. Of course, Reavers in Banished Mirrors are still the bane of Banshee's existence, but oftentimes what you want to do is just get a big mass of them before you reveal it, and then they won't have enough Reaver to deal with it, and you can win the game that way if you're in kind of a prolonged Wraith fight and you see that your opponent's neglecting Reavers. I think they also combo well with Scarabs, but yeah, just good mobility, a good overall air unit, kind of what the Hornet wants to be but just isn't. Good Tech 3 upgrade, and like I said, combos well with the Tech 3 Suicide Grunt as well, just completely negating any infantry counter. Next is this guy. I think this is August or something. Gonna drop it in the B tier for the same reasons. And then I'll rank Leon as well. He's not in the same tier as the other two. He's more of like a C tier. Completely scuffed honor guard, with no cloak, less health, less damage, I believe, and less speed, I think. Maybe he might have the same speed. I don't know. I don't play Jerome a lot. He's bad. And, you know, a hijack that misfires a bunch of the time. The Vulture. Okay, once again, the mic did the thing. I think I was on the Vulture. S tier unit. UNSC's probably just best overall unit. The nukes are great. The only issue is that they're so expensive they can kind of bankrupt you, and you need typically a strong 3 base eco in order to get them out and not risk losing the game, because if you lose your first Vulture army and you can't afford to repop it, you're just dead. So that's the main issue, but once you have that eco built up, there's really no weakness to the Vulture. They even do pretty well against Reavers, which is surprising. Obviously a great base breaking tool, good against other air units as well because they have that anti-air missile. They're just all around very solid units, and part of the reason Hornets are so overshadowed. The Methane Wagon, probably an A tier unit. I would put it in A+, but I think they're a little bit expensive. Definitely a good part of Yap's kit, but you're not always going to see people going for them, mostly because of that cost factor. But sometimes, a good amount of the time, people go for Methane Wagons. And if they don't go for Methane Wagon, they're going to be going for drop and just trying to preserve the Methane Wagon that they get in the drop. Methane Wagon Locust is a good unit composition, but it's very power heavy. So typically Yap is only going to get into that later on into the game when they're rich. You start out pretty poor when you're playing Yap. Combos well with your infantry, heavy grunts, and grunt riders. And the Y ability, very good to just be able to put methane on whatever you want to put it on. And then you can combo that with a beam, and that's just like an instant hero kill. So that's another nice little perk. I'm gonna go ahead and start going through these a little bit faster now, I think. This is the Infused Engineer. I'm gonna put it in B tier. Nowhere near the normal Engineer because you don't get that 40% damage reduction, but them spreading goo is still nice. Any way to spread goo when you're playing Vortis is a nice thing to have. And I think when you're building the Volatile Scarab, you need to be building a lot of these because you kind of need to spam the living hell out of these things because you don't have that 40% damage reduction. Of course, it's also nice to be able to set up Invigs and Cataclysm and whatnot with just spamming Y abilities with a shit ton of engineers. Of course, this is as high as I can really put it, but not a bad unit, just pales in comparison to the regular version. Next is the Nightingale. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. Once again, I'd like to put it in the A+, but it's an expensive unit and they're kind of frail for the cost that you pay. But that smoke Y ability is super useful. You can shut down scarabs with it, shut down most anything, save your base, save your hero with it. And Gales, unlike engineers, can heal multiple units at the same time, so that's a nice little benefit. But as good as the smoke ability is, it still can't really hold a candle to the 40% damage reduction of the engineer and just the cheap cost of the engineer, so not quite on the same level. Next is the Mastodon, and I'm going to put that right with the Wraith Invader. Basically everything about the Wraith Invader applies to the Mastodon. They're just kind of, a lot of management goes into them, and they're not particularly impressive. Mobility is an issue for them, unlike for the Phantom, so that's why they are way down here and the Phantom's way up there. Next is the Marauder. I'm thinking this is kind of, I'd say a B+ unit. Definitely not on the same level as the Hog because of the cost, and you're not going to be able to harass quite as well with them because they're slower, but they do better in head-on fights, and that's nice. And the slow that you get with them is also very nice. for dealing with heroes, making sure they can't get away. Also against the Retriever in particular, it's nice to have Marauders in your army comp, because often you're trying to kill it with your Reavers, it just flies over some terrain. You maybe use your jump, it just flies over some more terrain. But if you have a couple Marauders, you can slow it down and kill it pretty easily. Same goes for any other high priority unit. Marauders are just nice to have. Thick Hide is also an okay option in the late game. I'd say more so against UNSC because they don't have quite as potent anti-vehicle, and they just trade pretty well. They're super bulky, and they don't have the same damage as Wraiths, but they can still trade very cost efficiently, so they're not bad even at that point. Next is the Mantis. I'd put the Mantis... I'd put it in the B tier. It's not as bad as the Flamehog, that's for sure. The shields are nice, they're strong in a head-on fight, and you can make them invulnerable, but they don't have the speed of the Hog. And that is the main drawback. When you're playing UNSC, you want to be all over the map and harassing with Warthogs, and you can't do that quite as well with Mantises, and you might think that, well, you can kind of do it with Pelican, but not really. You want to hold Pelican and use it defensively if you get into a bad spot and you need to get your units out. That's what you want to use Pelican for, not so much to be making attacks all across the map. That then, if you get yourself into a bad situation, you have no way to get out. So, better in a head-on fight, but overall usefulness is just lower, much lower. The Blisterback is next. I think the Blisterback should probably be put in C+ tier. They are expensive, high population, kind of micro-intensive if your enemy is good about getting on top of them. Typically you see people just put them under shields and try and vet them up, because once they're vetted up they are actually pretty good. But without the vet, I find their DPS rather lacking. Compared to a Kodiak, you have less range, and you have to wait for Tech 3 to be able to build them. And at that point, why not just go Wraiths? Doesn't always make a ton of sense to be building them. I think Vortis, his Blisterbacks are a good amount better. They'd probably be like up here. But as for the base Blisterback, down here I think makes more sense. And this is the singular F tier unit in the game, the Condor. I shouldn't have to explain this. As long as your units are moving, the Condor cannot hit them. It has no shields, not a whole lot of health, so it's just kind of a super shitty Retriever that can't hit anything. You shouldn't ever be building these. If you're building these, you're trolling. Hunter Captain, I'd put him in the kind of A category. That's as high as I'll put him. I think Tech 1, he's not all that useful. He's pretty squishy at that point. Against some UNSC, it can be annoying, someone shoving a Hunter Captain down your throat early on in the game. But as long as it's scouted, snipers can still deal with it. And later on, movement speed is still an issue, and teleport doesn't remedy that because, once again, like Pelican, teleport is defensive power. You only really want to use it when you need to get out of a bad situation or dodge a leader power or something like that. But of course he's super tanky, has a siphon, and overall damage is good as well. So, better than most heroes. It just doesn't really help you in the early game all that much. And the Shroud is next. I'll probably put that in the B tier as well. I'm actually going to put it in the C+ tier because sometimes you do need Shrouds. against Kodiak spam, you do need these units. But it sucks to build them because they're so expensive and they take so long to build. It seems like you need double Apex in order to be pumping these as well as engineers, because you need both of them against siege spam. But these take so long to build, and it just kind of sucks because they're not the most useful unit in the world, but they're mandatory when dealing with siege. They're also nice against like a Forge Hog or a Chosen, but typically not actually worth building for just countering that, because against like a Chosen, they can do the micro thing where they shoot at the ground, shoot at the air, shoot at the ground, shoot at the air, and that cancels out the Shroud for the most part. And most Forge players are going to have Wolves, and even Hogs will be able to shoot these things out of the sky pretty easily. So for being expensive and taking a long time to build and not having all that much use outside of their niche, I'd put them around here, although they are mandatory in those niche situations. And the last unit, the Sniper. I'll probably put the Sniper in the B+ tier. They outlive their usefulness when you hit Tech 2. Very vulnerable to leader powers, but on Tech 1 they are quite good. Very long range, great kiting potential. A good counter to Suis, although you do need a good amount of them just to be able to snipe down Suis before they can hit you. And they are very micro intensive as well. You don't want to be looking away from your army a whole lot of the time when you have snipers, because you never know what's going to happen. They're always quite vulnerable. But like I said, the kiting potential is there, so if you know what you're doing, they're a great asset. And later on in Tech 3, Stanchion is a good upgrade. You don't see it all that often, but it's pretty useful against like a Desi drop, for example, or just any Tech 3 hero that you're struggling to deal with, they'll be able to take care of. Some people like to combo them with like Scorpions or maybe even Grizzlies, but that meta I think may have come and gone. You may still see that a little bit. With Johnson in particular, putting them in bunkers is very nice. So some leaders have better snipers than others. I think generally whoever has more passives, cutters are obviously good. Kinsanos are good as well. Like if you get Heat of Battle procced on a sniper, they go from flimsy to extremely tanky. So that's also nice to be able to have passives on these things, and they get even stronger. And yeah, that's it. I guess this is about where I think each unit should be. And yeah, most units are usable in this game. I'd say anything like B and up are good units. C+, it's like kind of lacking a little bit, but passable. And then C and down, these are units that you don't really want for the most part, especially the Condor. You never have an excuse to build a Condor. So I don't know how long this video is going to turn out to be, but pretty long. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you when I see you.